Soviet troops move into the bunker, and they confirm not just the fall of the Third Reich, but the death of Adolf Hitler himself.
For 70 years, a silence hung over one of history's darkest chapters. But every silence has a story. This is not a story of battlefields or politics, but of a single, ordinary life caught in the wake of unimaginable infamy. It is about Johann Schmidt Junior, a man who spent his life hidden in the shadows, not for any crime he committed, but for a connection he was born into. His name was a secret, his existence a rumor. Now that silence is finally broken. This is the human story behind a name the world thought it knew, and the devastating price paid by those that history forgot. You won't find his face in the history books. He wasn't a soldier or a spy. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary man. He probably dreamed ordinary dreams of a family, a quiet home, a simple life. But Johann was born with a ghost in his bloodline, a shadow that would eventually stretch across a continent and darken his entire world. He was the cousin of Adolf Hitler. Imagine that for a moment, not as a historical footnote, but as a real, breathing person. What must it have been like to carry that knowledge? To look at your own face in the mirror and wonder if you saw a faint resemblance to the man who was setting the world on fire. While his infamous cousin shaped the fate of millions from his chancellery, Johann was just trying to live his life, a single, anonymous soul in the Austrian countryside. But history has a way of collecting its debts, and when the war ended in a storm of fire and ruin, the reckoning began. The victors sought out everyone connected to the nightmare, from the highest commanders to the most distant relatives. And that is how Johann Schmidt Junior, a man who had likely never held any real power, became a prisoner of it. He was just one of millions caught in the grinding gears of a post-war world, a world fueled by vengeance and a desperate need for justice. His crime was not what he had done, but who he was, by an accident of birth. So, as the world celebrated its hard-won peace, a different, colder reality descended for Johann. The warmth of his homeland faded, replaced by the biting wind of the Siberian steppe. This is where our story truly begins, not at a grand desk, but in a labor camp, in the silence that followed the war's roar. What was the fate of those who shared the dictator's blood? The answer is more tragic and more human than you might think. To understand Johann's story, we have to travel back to a place far from the grand parade grounds and bombed-out cities. We have to go to the Waldviertel, a quiet, wooded corner of Austria, north of the river Danube. It's a place of rolling hills and small farms, where life was for centuries measured by the harvest and the turning of the seasons. It was here, in this unassuming landscape, that the tangled family tree of the Hitlers took root. And tangled is the right word for it. The story begins with a mystery that has haunted historians for decades: the identity of Adolf Hitler's paternal grandfather. We know his grandmother was a woman named Maria Schicklgruber, but who the grandfather was remains a closed book. Was it the man her mother later married, Johann Georg Hiedler? Or was it someone else entirely, perhaps even a man from a local Jewish family? The truth died with Maria. This single, unanswered question created a cloud of uncertainty that Adolf Hitler himself feared, a secret at the very foundation of his own identity. This uncertainty rippled outwards, shaping the family. Out of this complex web, one branch decided to simplify things. Maria's son, Alois, changed his last name from Schicklgruber to Hitler. It was this man, Alois Hitler, who would become the father of the future dictator. But families are like trees. they have a central trunk, but they also have many branches. While Alois's line became the one that would change world history, his sisters had their own families, their own children, who grew up in the same quiet Austrian countryside. One of these sisters was named Johanna Hiedler. She had a daughter who was given the name Maria Schmidt. Maria Schmidt is the crucial link in our story. She was, quite simply, Adolf Hitler's cousin. They shared a grandmother. While Adolf moved away first to Linz and then to Vienna, chasing his ambitions, Maria stayed. She lived the life her cousin had left behind. She married a man named Karl Koppensteiner, and they had a son. They were an ordinary family, connected by blood to a rising political star, but likely wanting nothing more than to be left alone to their lives. And this is where Johann Schmidt Junior enters the picture. He was the son of Maria's brother, making him Maria's nephew. This meant that Johann was not Hitler's direct cousin, but rather his first cousin once removed. He was a part of the extended convoluted family web, a young man growing up in the shadow of a name that was becoming both famous and infamous. So, while the world came to know the name Hitler through roaring crowds and terrifying newsreels, for the Schmidts and the Koppensteiners in the Waldviertel, it was just a family name. It was the name of a relative who had moved away and made good, or so it might have seemed at first. They couldn't have known that this familial connection, this accident of birth, rooted in the muddy fields of their homeland, would one day reach out across Europe to decide their fates. The ordinary branches of the family tree were about to be shaken by a storm created by its most infamous member. As the 1930s wore on, the name Hitler stopped being just a family name. It became a slogan, a symbol of national revival for some, and a word of terror for others. For those who actually shared his blood, it became an impossible burden. Their lives were no longer their own. They were now characters in a story he was writing, and the ending for many of them was far from certain. Imagine the dilemma. Do you lean into the connection, hoping for some favor or protection, or do you hide, praying that no one ever discovers the secret you carry in your family tree? There was no single answer, and the different paths taken by Hitler's relatives showed just how dangerous and complicated their world had become. On one side of the spectrum was his nephew, William Patrick Hitler. He was a half-Irish lad from Liverpool who saw the family name not as a curse, but initially as an opportunity. He moved to Germany in the 1930s, hoping his uncle would give him a glamorous job. But he was quickly disappointed. He realized he was seen as an embarrassment, a foreign relative with a murky background. Feeling slighted and seeing the true, brutal nature of the regime, William did something incredibly bold. He fled back to the West and became a public critic. He wrote articles with titles like "Why I Hate My Uncle," turning his family shame into a public spectacle in a desperate attempt to distance himself. He was, in essence, shouting from the rooftops, "I am not one of them." His was a war of noise. And then there was the silence. This was the path chosen by the Schmidts and the Koppensteiners back in Austria. For them, William's very public rebellion must have been terrifying. It drew attention. It reminded the world, and more importantly, it reminded the Nazi Party that the Führer had a family. While William was causing a stir in America and Britain, Maria Koppensteiner and her nephew, Johann Schmidt Junior, were trying to become invisible. Their fear would have been a constant cold companion. Who could they trust? A neighbor with a grudge? A local party official looking for promotion? A careless word over a pint in the pub could lead to a knock on the door in the middle of the night. The regime was notoriously paranoid. Would they really allow the cousins of the all-powerful Führer to just live as ordinary farmers? Or were they considered a security risk, a potential source of embarrassment? They couldn't celebrate their relationship, but they also couldn't deny it. They were trapped in a terrible paradox. Their famous cousin was the center of a cult of personality, yet acknowledging him could get them killed. They lived in a gray space, a world of whispered conversations and averted eyes. Every official form that asked for family details was a moment of panic. Every introduction to a stranger was a potential threat. While William Patrick Hitler used his name as a weapon to fight back from a safe distance, the Austrian relatives had to bury theirs like a shameful secret. For them, survival wasn't about making a stand. It was about staying quiet. It was about hoping that the towering, destructive shadow of their relative would simply pass over them, leaving them untouched in their small corner of Austria. But the war has a way of finding everyone in the end. As the conflict dragged on and Germany's fortunes turned, the regime became more ruthless, more controlling. The net tightened. The silence that had protected the Schmidts for so long was becoming thinner, more fragile. They were about to learn that in a total war, even obscurity is no guarantee of safety. Their fate was no longer in their hands. It was tied to the falling fortunes of a man whose very name they had learned to fear. In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe ended. For millions, it was a day of liberation, a long-awaited moment of joy and tears and overwhelming relief. The silence was finally broken by the sound of church bells and celebration. But if you were living in Austria, particularly in the Soviet-occupied zone, the end of the war was not a simple ending. It was the beginning of a new, and in many ways, just as terrifying chapter. The Soviet soldiers who marched into the villages and towns of the Waldviertel were not there as tourists. They were the hardened veterans of the most brutal war in human history. They had seen their own cities burned, their families murdered, their country torn apart. They came not just as occupiers, but as avengers. Their rage was deep, and it was personal. In the immediate aftermath, the hunt began. It was a righteous hunt at first. The world demanded that those responsible for the horrors of the Holocaust and the war be brought to justice. High-ranking Nazis were tracked down. Party members were rounded up. But on the ground, the idea of justice can sometimes blur into something much simpler: vengeance. And vengeance is rarely precise. It doesn't always care for fine details like personal guilt or innocence. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, had lists, they had files, and their mission was to cleanse the land of any trace of the Nazi plague. This didn't just mean the party members or the SS officers. It meant anyone who could be seen as connected to the regime. And in their eyes, what connection could be more direct than sharing blood with the architect of it all? For the Schmidt and Koppensteiner families, the end of the nightmare they had survived for 12 long years should have been their salvation. The tyrant was dead. The swastika was torn down. They could finally breathe. They must have believed their long silence had paid off. But the knock on the door came anyway. When the soldiers arrived, it wasn't because Johann Schmidt Junior had been a member of the Nazi Party. It wasn't because he had held any strong political beliefs or committed any crime. The soldiers likely didn't even know him as Johann, the farmer, the neighbor. They knew him only as a single, chilling entry on a list, a blood relative of Adolf Hitler. In that moment, the family name transformed from a secret shame into a death sentence. The very obscurity they had cultivated for their own protection now worked against them. They had no public profile, like William Patrick Hitler, who was safely in the West. They were just names on a page, faceless relations to be swept up in a vast and merciless dragnet. The principle was cold and absolute. The family of the enemy must also be punished. It was a biblical eye for an eye, delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. There were no trials to determine their individual guilt, no one to listen to their pleas that they were just ordinary people, victims themselves of a name they never chose. They were simply arrested, declared enemies of the state, and loaded onto trains. Their journey into the heart of the Soviet Empire towards the frozen labor camps of Siberia had begun. The war was over, but their suffering was just entering its final, most desolate phase. The end began with the sound of boots on the gravel path. For Johann Schmidt Junior, his parents, and his cousin, there was no time for goodbyes, no chance to pack a proper suitcase with warm clothes or a photograph of home. The soldiers at the door were not there to ask questions. They were there to collect. The family was given minutes. The life they had known, the farm that had been in their family for generations, was reduced to a memory in the time it takes to boil a kettle. They were taken to a railway station, but not a passenger terminal. They were herded towards a siding, where a line of cattle cars stood waiting. Their doors slid open to reveal a dark, straw-strewn interior. The air was thick with the smell of fear and despair. They were pushed inside, joining a huddle of other frightened souls, former mayors, minor officials, and others deemed politically suspicious. The heavy doors slammed shut, bolted from the outside, plunging them into a twilight lit only by cracks in the wooden walls. This was the start of their journey into the unknown. The train would jolt into motion, and for weeks it would crawl eastwards, away from the green hills of Austria, towards the heart of Russia. The world outside the cracks changed slowly. The familiar Alps gave way to vast, flat plains that seemed to go on forever, and then gradually the landscape hardened, and the air that seeped through the gaps took on a bitter, new sharpness, the cold of the Siberian frontier. Inside the carriage, life was reduced to its most basic and brutal level. There was a single bucket for a toilet. Food was a thin, greasy soup, and a crust of black bread handed out once a day, if they were lucky. The cold became a physical presence, a third occupant in the car that seeped into their bones as they huddled together for warmth. The straw on the floor was their bed, their chair, their entire world. People grew weak. Sickness spread through the cramped space, with no medicine to fight it. The journey was a slow, rolling torture. When the train finally, mercifully stopped, the doors opened to a sight that must have crushed their spirits. They were in the middle of a vast, white wilderness. The trees were heavy with snow, and the wind cut like a knife. This was their new home, a labor camp, a series of bleak wooden barracks surrounded by a fence of barbed wire and watchtowers. Here, the struggle was not just to live, but to remember why they should bother. The days were a cycle of exhaustion. They were forced to do back-breaking labor, felling trees in the frozen forest or working on construction projects, their hands raw and blistered. Their clothes were thin, their boots were often falling apart, and their hunger was a constant, gnawing pain. They were not people with names and histories anymore. They were prisoners, numbers in a system designed to work them until they could work no more. For Johann, the warmth of his Austrian homeland must have felt like a dream from another lifetime. His crime was not treason or murder or theft. His crime was a family connection, a trick of birth. And for that, he was condemned to slowly freeze and to slowly starve in the immense, unforgiving cold of Siberia. There is no headstone for Johann Schmidt Junior in the cold, vast earth of Siberia. No marker bears his name. No cross signifies his resting place. His grave, like those of millions of others who fell in that unforgiving system, is unmarked. It is a patch of frozen ground, somewhere in the immense wilderness, long since lost to memory. The official, heartbreaking truth, which only came to light decades later, is simply this. Johann Schmidt Junior died in a Siberian labor camp. He did not die a hero's death, nor a villain's. He died a prisoner. His crime was not of his own making. It was written in his bloodline. He was worked to exhaustion, likely in the bitter cold, felling trees with a hunger that was never satisfied. The cold, the hunger, the disease, one of them, or all of them together, finally claimed him. He was just one man, caught in the grinding gears of history's vengeance. And then, the final, bitter twist to his story. Years after the snow had settled over his memory, long after the camp gates had rusted shut, an official investigation was conducted by the Russian government. They reviewed the cases of the Schmidt family and hundreds of other Austrians who had been swept up in 1945. Their conclusion was a vindication that came far too late. They found no evidence of any crimes committed by them. Not a single evidence. Johann, his mother Maria, his father, his cousin, they were not Nazis. They were not conspirators. They were not a threat. They were guilty of nothing more than a family connection, a name they shared with a monster. The very thing that should have been their private burden became their death sentence. The system that arrested them in a fit of rage later admitted on paper that it had been wrong. But for Johann, that admission was just words on a page. It couldn't bring him back. It couldn't warm him. It couldn't give him the simple, ordinary life he had surely wanted. So, we are left with a terrible and profound irony. Johann Schmidt Junior was a relative of the 20th century's greatest villain. Yet he was not a perpetrator. He was a victim. He suffered and died not because of anything he did, but because of who his cousin was. In the end, the shadow of Adolf Hitler consumed not only millions of innocent lives across Europe, but also the lives of his own distant family, people who were simply trying to live in obscurity. His story is a stark reminder that history's long, dark shadow falls not just on the great and the powerful, but on the small and the anonymous too. It falls on the ordinary people who never asked to be part of the story. Johann's life was defined by a name he did not choose, and his death was decided by an association he could never escape.